Hey everybody, I wanted to give a big thank you for shooting my channel past 100 subscribers. You guys are awesome, and I'm glad I can provide analysis that people can enjoy. Also, thanks for the patience. I had some stuff to take care of in real life, so I couldn't dedicate the time to a review the past couple of weeks. I suspect some of you are fixated on that massive time code at the bottom of your screen. When I first started the series, I wanted to keep each video under about 35 minutes, but with keywords getting more and more complicated, that just proved to be impossible if I really wanted to do it justice. Just to compare, my typical script has been about 15 pages long, while Cadmus is at 24, and that's after I trimmed and condensed it as much as I could. Anyway, point is, Cadmus might be the most intricate and complex keyword in the game, and so that's why the video is so long this time. I hope you all enjoy it anyway, and let's get into it. Before we begin, if you aren't familiar with my rating system, you should watch the explanation linked in the video description. Remember that these first impressions reviews are made in the context of Gaining Grounds 1 with everything that we know about that meta, so some options' usefulness may change with the introduction of Gaining Grounds 2. Anything stated in this video is ultimately my own opinion. If you disagree with anything I say, let me know in a comment below. I'll be compiling and responding to feedback in a Q&A video later on. Also, my channel is small and won't be releasing videos daily, so you're unlikely to see them unless you hit those YouTube buttons you always hear about. It costs nothing and lets you know when my content comes out, and it gives me that dopamine hit I need to keep working on the series. So please subscribe, like the video, and write something to me in the comments. It really means a lot. Playstyle Prediction. Cadmus may be the most unique, most complex, and most micromanagement-heavy keyword in all of Malifaux. The keyword lacks almost nothing and has many powerful and rare features like summoning multiple models, irreducible damage, irresistible damage, sharing damage amongst themselves, bouncing damage to enemies, area control markers, 3 kinds of condition manipulation, strong healing, ignoring resistance triggers, ignoring hard to kill and demise, boosts to initiative, always out-activating the opponent, and even more that I might not think of right now. They form a central nest, spawning more and more underlings over time to swarm the enemy and infest them with parasites. Undisturbed, this grows their force and gives them control over the enemy, leading to one of the most overpowered late games of any crew. That might seem terrifying, but the operative word there is undisturbed. All of Cadmus's most powerful effects either cost a resource or require conditions be met before they work. Every piece is a cog in the Cadmus machine, and it doesn't run for free. The machine may be a flamethrower that will also cure cancer in an hour, but if the battery is destroyed or the cog placement doesn't match the blueprints, in the end it's just a useless paperweight in a burning building. If it's not obvious already, this one is not for beginners. Keyword features. The Will of Cadmus upgrade. I'll do my best to explain this upgrade as simply and thoroughly as possible. Will of Cadmus starts on Nexus. If she gets killed, it immediately attaches to any other Cadmus model of your choice. The upgrade provides 2 benefits. The first is giving parasite tokens their in-game effect. Enemy models with parasite tokens can be treated as both friendly and Cadmus by Cadmus models in your crew. Just to clarify, out-of-keyword models hired in your Cadmus crew have no way of being treated as Cadmus, nor do they have any way of treating enemies as friendly. Treating enemies this way enables several actions and abilities in the crew. Most importantly, We Are Legion, Nexus's omnipresent influence and exoskeletal connection, and the Will of Cadmus action on this upgrade. It only lets your models treat enemies as friendly, not the other way around, so you won't benefit from enemy auras and pulses. However, friendly Cadmus can relent against attacks from enemy parasited models, letting them hit but forcing a double negative flip. This is strong against models like Seamus who really want to hit severe, to generally cancel out enemy focus when it's used, or in situations where the target will die to moderate damage but not weak. It's especially good on full health EyesAndEars who have terrible stats but are still protected by innocent bystander. Be careful though, relenting lets the opponent get triggers with weak cards. Finally, if an enemy gains more than 1 parasite token, it instead takes 2 irreducible damage, giving Cadmus a decent anti-armor option. Note that the credit for killing an enemy this way goes to the upgrade carrier, which matters for strategies, schemes, and some abilities, usually demise. Cadmus can spread parasite tokens with Nexus's melee attack, Shambling Nest's melee attack, Meredith's Rancid Transplant trigger, and what I'm going to call the Parasite Token Pulse. This is always a 2-inch pulse and requires a simple defense duel or gain a Parasite token. Nexus's bonus action is TN14, Spell Eater's bonus action is TN12 and also affects the target, and both Berserker Husk Swarm of Might's trigger and EyesAndEars Demise are in the middle at TN 13. Spell Eaters and Husk's Parasite Pulses only affect models who suffer the 1 damage, so they can be avoided with damage reduction. Determining whether to try forcing Parasite tokens or letting them happen accidentally as the crew pursues other goals is a notable playstyle choice. I believe it's not that necessary to force them. The threat of Parasite tokens is valuable for draining the resources of a scare opponent all on its own. Now the second half. Connected Conscience gives an additional activation after all models have activated, but with slow and only the Will of Cadmus action available, meaning no bonus action. Will of Cadmus is a pseudo-obey. First, let's look at the stat. From reading discussion on forums, I noticed players restricting their crews harshly in keyword for a higher Will of Cadmus stat, which is a mistake. A more flexible or effective crew composition will be worth much more than an obey succeeding on 4 or even 8 additional cards. If the goal is to get the stat high enough to consistently use on enemies, you're fighting a losing battle. I think by the end of turn 3 it's almost impossible to have stat 6 Will of Cadmus against a good opponent. To make things simple, I assume it'll just be stat 4, but plus or minus 1 depending on circumstance. Will of Cadmus has 4 primary uses. Walk or disengage to reposition a model, ram trigger to attack, concentrate to stack focus, or interact. The Crow trigger can let an EyesAndEars or Nest ignore insignificant, similar to how Big Hat uses Gremlin Criers. This doesn't just let your models scheme, it also lets them threaten schemes. EyesAndEars and Nests are cheap and require attention from the opponent if he thinks they're going to score you victory points. The Mask trigger isn't as useful as the other ones, but even the smallest positioning adjustments can sometimes fix huge problems for Cadmus. The duel requires a 7 at best, and can't be used on the same model twice. So if you don't save a card, just throw it out without a suit, and if the duel is passed, concentrate for free. Most notably, this somewhat makes the crew impossible to out-activate as long as scoring only requires 1 action, like walking into engagement with a take-prisoner target. It also adds a totally separate activation, making stun, staggered, and slow end before the following turn. Start of activation effects trigger an additional time too, which matters for Meredith's Fungus and healing. Nexus is by far the best choice for carrying this upgrade, so you don't want her to die. She has 2 AP, can pick her suit with Siphon Power, and Omnipresent Influence can effectively double or triple the range. If she dies, all the remaining Cadmus leaders have reason to hold the upgrade, some better than others depending on the situation. Archivist keeps the Siphon Power for suits. Meredith gets to use a Fungus Among Us a second time, and she can still use suits with Soulstones. And Night Silk Creeper gets to use Seize of Prey to reposition when he activates, probably the worst one. I hope I was able to make sense of it, but it's a complicated upgrade, so rewind and listen to it again if you need to. We Are Legion is the second text-heavy keyword feature for Cadmus. Put simply, when taking damage or healing, a model with this ability can pass 1 damage or healing onto a friendly Cadmus within 4 inches. Each model receiving in this way can only do so once per activation. This by itself allows Cadmus to spread damage to their worst models and give healing to the best. It doesn't actually reduce the total damage taken by the crew, but it can significantly reduce pressure. That being said, obviously this is best used to pass damage to parasited enemies. When it's set up properly, it begins to resemble the Urami keyword, reducing incoming damage by 1 and dealing it back, except in this case only once per activation per enemy, and only to enemies within 4 inches, and only if they have parasite tokens, and can you see how Cadmus really needs a lot of setup and positioning to work properly. Anyway, for healing at least, it's not 100% clear if Cadmus can use Legion when they're already at full health, because the wording states when the model heals, not when the model would heal. But despite this, the consensus on forums seems to lean towards yes, that healing can be passed even when at full health, and I agree, so I'm going to be treating it as if it can. Even if we find out later that it can't in an FAQ, then it doesn't really change much because you have a lot of opportunity to siphon power off of something in order to take it down a notch and then heal it back up. To close out Legion, we have 3 interesting interactions to note. Number 1, nothing prevents Legion from passing a damage even if the damage taken is irreducible, allowing you to ping enemies. Number 2, Legion can be chained from Cadmus to Cadmus as long as each link is only 4 inches from the last and no model is used more than once per activation. And number 3, damage from incoming sources are reduced while damage passed down is attributed to the model who uses Legion. Passing damage around allies before giving it to a 1 health enemy can change kill credit and make you feel like a genius. Transmutation and Valued Conditions. The transmutation trigger on Nexus and Spell Eaters turns any valued condition into a new one at a maximum of +2. The valued conditions are focused, shielded, distracted, injured, poison, and burning. On friendly models, transmutation is for turning +2 conditions into focused +2. It's a little awkward with shielded because damage applies first, so the target needs shielded +3 to get focus +2. Offensively, the best fuel for transmutation is taking focused or other beneficial conditions off of enemies, but it'll also be common to use Cadmus's own poison and injured. The best offensive transmutations are poison into injured early in the turn to ensure a kill, and late in the turn injured will expire anyway, so turning that into burning or distracted is a good choice. Don't worry about stacking burning or poison high. Except in rare situations, AP is much better used dealing damage directly than stacking conditions. Webs, Scheme Markers, and the Summoning Nest. Web markers can be created by Nexus with Exoskeletal, the Spin Web trigger on Archivist and Night Silk, and Night Silk's bonus action. These all have different effective ranges, and if attacking allies may come at a cost. Webs are 50mm, destructible, severe, and in addition to the common terrain marker uses, they can fuel what I call the Summoning Nest, not to be confused with Shambling Nests, which are Nexus's totem. Nexus summons EyesAndEars with her bonus action, increasing in target number depending on how many. It requires a 5, 8, or 11 for 1, 2, and 3 respectively. Technically you can get 4 with the red joker, but the red joker is better used elsewhere. Nexus definitely wants 3 EyesAndEars on turn 1, preferably 3 on turn 2, and will be more than happy with 2 on turns 3 and 4 if she can manage. Meredith acts as the second half of the nest. She activates after an EyesAndEars is summoned nearby and replaces it with a Berserker Husk. She also provides a ton of healing to the crew as all these cheap models activate near her, but we'll go over this in more detail during her card review. The difficult part, as always with Cadmus, is resource cost and positioning. Nexus needs 1 web or scheme marker per EyesAndEars, and all the markers need to be within a tiny 2-inch pulse of a single friendly Cadmus. This isn't hard, but it's not exactly easy either. Only a few models can make webs, and ski markers can't be dropped within 4 inches of each other with interact actions. Meredith also needs a web marker to make the husk, although later in the game she can also use corpse markers. In total, to make 2 EyesAndEars and a husk, you need 4 markers, which for the most part requires at least 4 actions plus moving into position. Taking models who can drop multiple scheme markers in an activation can reduce the dependency on webs, especially if they can get around the 4-inch placement restriction. The more models that Cadmus hires that can fill this role, the more resilient the nest becomes to enemy interference, but also the more constricted the crew becomes, especially if there are no scheme marker based schemes in the pool. Similarly, the more Cadmus fuels and babysits the summoning nest, the less actions they have remaining to fight the enemy. It's all about balance. One last thing I'll mention is that the Flush with Cash upgrade is absolutely absurd with Cadmus. Constantly creating flimsy models makes it possible to double or even triple the Soulstone investment. Master, Totem, and EyesAndEars. Nexus, 15 cost Master. Nexus is an odd Master blend, part summoner and part damage dealer with strong movement support. First and foremost, she's squishy. 7 willpower is excellent, but 5 defense with 11 health is very fragile. It's like English Ivan without all the concealment, mobility, and damage immunity. Legion and Soulstones are going to have to pull a lot of weight when Nexus is targeted. Next, let's get mobility out of the way. Nexus is quite slow with 4 move, but she can charge every turn for free repositioning. She'll need a little help getting into the center initially, but when she's there she shouldn't have much trouble affecting the board. Now to put her actions in context, let's go over Siphon Power and Omnipresent Influence. The former gives her guaranteed suits at the cost of 1 damage to friendly models, but note this doesn't work with enemy parasited models. It's the model itself that may choose to take the damage, not Nexus forcing the damage onto a friendly model. Nexus wants to avoid damage on herself, preferring to use nearby allies as health batteries. Omnipresent Influence allows Nexus to use actions through friendly Cadmus within 12 inches, including parasited enemies, but she can't use a model more than once per activation. She still can't target herself with attacks, but she can target a model through itself. This ability is one of the primary reasons parasited enemies are so important. Nexus's melee attack is amazing, but getting 3 of them is difficult to pull off, especially on specific targets. Parasited enemies are always in danger, and endanger other enemies within an inch of them. Speaking of which, Hive Strike is Nexus's best action. 1-3-4 might not seem like much at first, but with stat 7, Siphon Power, and the discard or parasite choice, this attack becomes deadly. In ideal conditions, a Ram and Parasite token makes the damage track an effective 4-6-7. If Nexus is able to hit all 3 attacks per turn, that requires 3 discards from the opponent to not get parasited, which is nearly unheard of hand pressure on top of damage and triggers. The action's full potential comes from Transmutation. If Nexus removes Focused 1, that's already as good as slow in terms of action economy. Turning Focused 2 into Distracted or Injured 2 is worth what, maybe 3 actions? And that's on top of the damage and discard for the Parasite token. She can only Transmutation once per turn, but having it at all on a 7 stat makes it hard for your opponent to keep focus on models. The Ram trigger is the easiest to use, dealing 1 damage and refunding the Siphon life. The Crow trigger is strong too. If Nexus gets 2 Crows, that applies Injured 2 already. From there, Nexus can keep attacking with effective stat 9, or her horde of nests and EyesAndEars become effective stat 6. It makes anything originally stat 4 good, and anything better than that impossible to contest with cheating. Focus is obviously strong for hit chance and moderate damage. Options for stacking Focus include Meredith, a Spell Eater, or a Hopeful Prospect, all of which we'll get to discussing. Remember that Nexus can charge and melee normally like any other model. If the opponent overextends a model, she goes from "I'll take any attack I can get" to totally shredding the enemy. Exoskeletal Connection is a positioning support action, but it works a bit strangely. It first creates a web marker in base contact with a friendly Cadmus, and then places that friendly Cadmus next to the action's origin model. I remember how it works by knowing it's a pull, not a push. The model being moved is the target, and the model from which you draw range is the final destination. Similarly, remember the web is dropped before the model places, so it leaves a web behind rather than throwing one ahead. The action is great for moving the crew forward and building the summoning nest early in the game. Then in mid-game, Nexus primarily wants to be attacking, but Exoskeletal can still get models out of trouble and slow enemies down. For example, it can pull Archivist out of engagement while removing stunned and leaving a web marker behind to slow the enemy that engaged him in the first place. In late game, when AP is scarce, Exoskeletal becomes a powerful VP scoring and denial tool. It can move the same model multiple times, but since Nexus has to use a different origin model each time, it's difficult to set this up properly. At least in the case of needing enough movement to get all the way across a board. If used on a staggered ally, you can drop webs without moving them and then remove the condition too. Just be careful where you leave your trash. Despite webs being a primary Cadmus feature, most of the crew don't ignore severe terrain, or only do so partially. It's very possible to trap yourself just as much as you can trap the opponent. Finally, Nexus wants to be summoning, but if that isn't possible, she has a Parasite Pulse as a bonus action. If presented a good enough opportunity, I could see hitting 2 or 3 enemies with this being worth it over summoning a single EyesAndEars. I also may be too idealistic thinking Cadmus can keep setting up summons on turn 3 onward, in which case this bonus action is great. Cadmus have many options for irresistible damage, so the trigger is nothing special, but it's never bad to have. Overall, the danger Nexus poses, along with the summoning and will of Cadmus, should make it clear how important she is to the Cadmus game plan. Don't let her die. EyesAndEars, 2-cost minion. EyesAndEars are Nexus's summon, and I basically consider them her second totem. They provide melee presence, positioning help, and health as a resource to utilize. Generally, they'll stand near allies as health batteries or walk off to try engaging enemies as soon as possible. In some cases, they can also threaten schemes with the help of Will of Cadmus. While being a health battery, they can use lure to help with repositioning, although it requires an 8, which isn't ideal. Alternatively, they can concentrate for when they replace with a husk, or to Rancid Transplant focused with Meredith. If charging into combat, engage an enemy in base contact and try to get as many other enemies within the Demise Pulse. Their attack sucks but can sometimes give slow, and the real danger comes from Nexus attacking through them anyway. Eavesdrop is okay. Just throw it out, and if the opponent reveals an 8+, you should usually force him to cycle it, unless he has some scary focused severe damage lined up. Most of the time, even if a better card is drawn, consider that the better card would have been flipped for something anyway, and you removed an above average card from being used this turn. Instead, letting them keep the card gives you knowledge about the opponent's hand, which is never a bad result either. EyesAndEars have terrible defensive stats at 3-3, but that really doesn't matter thanks to Innocent Bystander. Forcing a TN of 12 is almost like EyesAndEars having average 5-5 defenses and always flipping a 7. There's more nuance with duel totals, but it's a good comparison. Against parasited enemies, this even gets better by relenting. This makes EyesAndEars more or less always have a 12 duel total and all damage flips are double negative. EyesAndEars are pretty simple and crucial for Cadmus to maximize efficiency. Because they're so easy to summon, they should never be hired. Shambling Nest, 3-cost minion totem. Nexus comes with a pair of these. They're very slow moving but have from the shadows, so they deploy to act as speed bumps, to control objectives, or to act as an early anchor for exoskeletal connections. They have a 2-inch engagement range, spread past tokens, can be used by Nexus to attack, and most importantly they have a ton of health with defense 5, hard to wound, healing, and We Are Legion. Just by existing, nests force the opponent to either get attacked, have objectives denied, spend AP disengaging, or churn out a gross amount of hard to wound We Are Legion health. As mentioned, their attack is phenomenal. It has a low stat 4, but that largely doesn't matter. Just throwing 2 to 4 attacks every turn will pressure cheats and eventually hit for no investment. The built-in healing makes nests effectively 10 or more health in practice. Swarm of Mites is situational. It's best when surrounded or when half the cost can be transferred to a parasited enemy. Of course, the nests are insignificant, but with Will of Cadmus you can get around this, and their primary role isn't scheming anyway. In fact, being insignificant can sometimes be a benefit because they don't give up points in public enemies or other similar strategies. Nests aren't perfect though. They can be vulnerable to large push effects because their threat range is only 5 inches for 2 attacks or 8 inches for 1. Having an incredibly low willpower doesn't help with this. Still, pretty small downside to such a good area control piece. With these and EyesAndEars available, Cadmus can usually afford to build very ranged heavy and still have enough melee presence to hold enemies back. Keyword choices. Dr. Meredith Stanley, 8-cost henchman. Meredith is Cadmus's primary support piece and acts as a pseudo-summoner as well. Healing Droughts, which, if I understand correctly, should be Healing Drafts, but I think that's dumb, so it's going to be Healing Droughts. Anyway, Healing Droughts, A Fungus Among Us, and Breakthrough Research make her the ideal candidate for Nexus to summon off of. Essentially, the sequence works like this. Nexus summons 3 EyesAndEars near Meredith. Meredith activates, heals herself for 1, and turns one of the summons into a Berserker Husk, healing it 3. Naturally, both of these heal effects can pass one to another Cadmus. Then each of the 2 remaining EyesAndEars and the Husk take their turns activating, healing themselves or a friendly model for 1 each. In total, this heals the crew for 7 health and turns the crappy EyesAndEars into a much more threatening Husk, all with 0 AP investment other than creating the markers. It also staggers the healing over many activations, which is amazing for triggering chronicle effects. Just note that Meredith needs to be in position for Fungus before she activates. Also know that Healing Droughts has an awkward 3-inch aura while all the others are 4 inches. When replacing, the Husk will have to choose whether it wants to hold back slightly for the 1 healing, or to place as far forward as possible to start charging at the enemy. If at any point an EyesAndEars or any friendly Cadmus is killed within this bubble, Meredith at least gets to draw a card as a consolation prize. It'll be rare to kill parasited enemies in range, but that counts too if you ever manage. Quarantine is Meredith's signature action, and is a good reason for her to activate early. This will either be used to protect herself or Nexus from being targeted by actions with less than 2-inch range, or to stick onto a Husk or Night Silk who can charge forward and act as a roadblock. Most of the time good opponents will prepare for this with 2-inch melee choices and movement effects, but no plan is perfect, and trapping the entire enemy crew is a great threat to have available. The mask trigger isn't amazing, but never discount an irresistible push. Her other bonus action is Doctor's Orders, which is movement support for turn 1 and against enemy crews who aren't bothered by quarantine. It can also be used for herself to get in position for attacks, or on parasited enemies for an irresistible push. Rancid Transplant is unbelievably flexible. In Experimental, Rancid Transplant exists on McMorning in a melee-focused crew, squandering its potential as a support action. But Meredith is already a support model who is happy to stay in the back in a crew which creates tons of super cheap models and can treat enemies as friendly models. Thus, Meredith can do any of the following. 1. Transfer Focused from an EyesAndEars or Nest onto Nexus. This can give Focus +2 on turn 2 with Will of Cadmus for the second Concentrate. 2. Stack Poison +2 on a friendly or enemy model, which can then be transmutationed into a better condition. 3. Rip Focused off of a parasited enemy and onto a friendly model with no chance to resist. 4. Transfer negative conditions from a weak parasited enemy onto another, more important enemy, like taking Stunned from an enemy minion and putting it onto their master, or transferring Injured from a nearly dead enemy onto one at full health. 5. Transfer a negative condition from an important ally onto an EyesAndEars, essentially acting as an unfailable condition removal. 6. Using the Crow trigger to give the enemy a parasite token. This only requires that Poison +1 is on any friendly model within 5 inches of it. And 7. Target important enemies within 5 inches of poisoned friendly models just to scare them into cheating, even if you don't intend to cheat a Crow. Now, some of these options obviously place Poison 2 and Injured 1 onto friendly models. The poison might deal a few damage, can be transmutationed, or can be passed back to enemies and enable pass tokens. It's a risky investment like all the other damage Cadmus does to itself. The Injured is a lot scarier, since even 1 point can risk an assassination run if the opponent has a good hand. This can be avoided by activating late in the turn so the Injured will expire, or by properly positioning to make assassinations harder to pull off. Lastly, we have Alchemical Vial. There isn't much to be said except that this is a great shockwave. It only requires a 5, it's shockwave 2, and it effectively deals 3 damage or sets up the Rancid Transplant for the Parasite trigger. Because of the range and the way shockwaves work, this is actually Meredith's longest range action with a maximum of slightly over 11 inches. When she doesn't have anything to Rancid Transplant, she can use this shockwave or drop scheme markers for the Summoning Nest. She benefits very little from Focused and can't use herself to pass conditions, so concentrating is not ideal. With all those impressive actions and effects, you might be expecting by now that the balancing is flimsy defenses, and you'd be right. Average 5/5 defenses and only 7 health is awful for her cost. She needs to stay healed up, keep out of range, and use soulstones or friendly models to keep her alive. Because the average soulstone prevention is 2, I basically consider Meredith a 9-cost model with 9 health. She and the Nest especially need to be careful when the enemy has blast attacks. When creating EyesAndEars or Husks, try to keep them at least 2 inches from all other allies to prevent single blasts from hitting more models, but still within 3 inches of Meredith for healing and within 4 inches of anyone who wants to use Legion or Siphon. If that sounds complicated, that's because it is. You are in luck though. If the enemy has double blasts or shockwaves, the Nest is basically screwed and you won't have to worry about all that difficult positioning. In this case, the only defense is playing with the Nest far in the back, removing the threat, or out-activating it and only summoning at the end of the turn. Final verdict? In keyword, 5 stars. Just by making Husks and healing, Meredith will earn more than her cost in 2 to 3 turns. The tricks she can do with her actions only solidify her as an auto-include. Out of keyword, 1 star. Get used to 1 star for these out of keywords because Cadmus really works only with itself. Meredith needs Nexus to do her job, so she doesn't provide enough to other keywords. Archivist, 8 cost Enforcer. Archivist begins the trend of more resilient Cadmus. 5/6 defenses and 8 health with Arcane Shield 2 is respectable and pairs incredibly well with Legion, sometimes making him take nothing from 2 damage hits. His long range and bonus action only help more. Like Nexus, Archivist has Siphon power and primarily acts as a ranged damage dealer who uses health batteries. He's only 4 move, but this virtually doesn't matter as he'll constantly use Deafening Silence to reposition. I consider the mask trigger to be the primary effect, giving Archivist roughly 5 inches to reposition. It also lets Archivist double drop scheme markers if required, but his actions are unfortunate to give up, so use this sparingly. The actual effect of the action forces the opponent to discard for actions that are not melee or gun, so most magic, support, and disruption effects. I consider this a free bonus for Archivist and whoever happens to be near him, but it can purposely be used as protection too. It also hinders enemies who want to target parasited models, and it applies to all actions, not attacks, making it almost like a light version of Hostile Work Environment, but only for parasited models, and only within 4 inches of this ranged model that doesn't want to be near enemies. And here we go again with Cadmus and their requirements. Inaudible Whisper is Archivist's attack. Stat 6 against willpower is particularly good because Cadmus almost exclusively targets defense. Much like Nexus's attack, hitting generates card advantage, in this case forcing the opponent to discard a tome or Archivist draws a card. Most of the time this will be card draw. Unlike Nexus's attack, Inaudible Whisper with the Crow trigger comes at a minimum damage 3 and ignores both Hard to Kill and Demise. I can't understate how valuable it is to have an anti-demise effect when models like Midnight Stalker and Serena Bowman are so common. Keywords with demise like Ancestor, Big Hat, and Academic are some of the best in the game too. Ignoring Hard to Kill is rare and highly impactful with 3-min damage, especially against model who heal above 1 easily. Instead of the +1 damage and ignoring abilities, Archivist can create web markers near the target. Creating rather than dropping means it can't be touching any model or other marker, and the 1-inch range means that Archivist can't create it outside of the Remove Destructible Terrain action's range. However, the attack still deals 2-3-4 and the web can effectively make the enemy slow, can allow Night Silk to teleport into melee, or adds fuel to the summoning nest. Note you still draw a card for hitting friendly models. Unfortunately, Whisper still suffers from concealment. Archivist will want focus just like Nexus does, not as much for the better damage flip, but to make sure that he can always attack twice for at least 3 in card draw. Font of Knowledge won't be used often, but it does create some neat tricks. Note Archivist needs to stay alive for it to work, and it replaces a suit rather than adding one. Archivist can provide 2 suits at once by siphoning one and flipping the other, but for any individual duel he can only replace one of them. Also, there's no way to give suits to friendly out of keyword models. Here are the best friendly uses I've thought of. 1. Give Night Silk tomes on turn 1 so he can generate 2 extra webs without damaging allies. 2. Give Nexus suits to avoid siphon damage or make hitting injured +2 easy. It affects her Will of Cadmus activation too, saving up to 5 health total. 3. Give an EyesAndEars tomes to increase their lure stat to 6 if that's 100% necessary to score or deny a VP. And 4, my personal favorite, give a Berserker Husk masks so he can activate, bonus action push, charge, shove aside to create good positioning, and then Swarm of Mites with the mask trigger. This moves the Husk at least 12 inches and the shoved enemy 4 inches to set up a perfect Parasite Pulse. The Husk can even shove aside again if obeyed by Nexus. Font of Knowledge can target parasited enemies too. With the right suit choice it shuts down triggers and can't be removed. More importantly, this can make hitting a suited target number anywhere from difficult to impossible. This can prevent common actions like Leap and Obey, which is already strong, but my favorite use is much more gross. This won't happen often, but Archivist can prevent enemy summoning. Traditional summoners will need 2 of their summon suit, meaning they need their summon card to be suited. This cuts the number of succeeding cards down to single digits, and makes those troublesome 13 summons close to impossible. Finally, the Impatience Tome trigger can ruin an opponent's activation order. Use it on enemies with shockwaves and blasts so that the nest can spread out and survive. The mask gives Archivist something that can push but will mostly go unused. And last but not least we have Ill Omens +2. This can set up top of turn rushes or offset the pass tokens Cadmus gives to the opponent. Cadmus features a lot of good top of turn options, so this ability is welcome. Notably, the Flush with Cash minion ability lets Archivist cheat initiative and still replace the lost card. Final verdict? In keyword, 5 stars. Archivist is Cadmus' second auto take. He brings too much offensive power, flexibility, and synergy to pass up. Out of keyword, 4 stars. Models with strong anti-demise effects are always on the table out of keyword. Archivist also provides card advantage, can make terrain, and nearly auto-wins initiative. Siphon power is going to hurt, so plan around that. He makes a good pairing with a botanist because both fuel each other. Also, some keywords can put damage on a model who doesn't care, like Mordrake or Activate Chronicle by getting below full health and then healing back. Night Silk Creeper, 8 cost Enforcer. Night Silk exemplifies the jack-of-all-trades, master-of-none archetype, as a hybrid tank, schemer, assassin, and disruptor. He doesn't excel in any of those roles relative to other models, but the flexibility of being able to fill those roles, even if they're not perfectly filled, is where he shines. Note that he comes on a 50mm base, which can be good for disrupting but bad for mobility around terrain. Unimpeded helps alleviate the mobility problem, but in a strategy like Symbols of Authority, impassable terrain can make it much more difficult for him to get in base contact with a strategy marker. Like with Archivist, Night Silk has good bulk at 6 defense, 8 wounds, and hard to wound. His willpower is a low 4, which makes him much better against defense targeting crews. Quote-unquote good bulk doesn't particularly make a tank though, and this wouldn't be a Cadmus model without setup requirements. That setup is nearby parasited enemies. Hard to Wound and Legion is arguably close to the godly Armor and 1 plus Hard to Wound combo, and it increases Night Silk's damage output. That kind of setup is necessary to tap into Night Silk's full potential, and it applies equally to well-positioned web markers for Seize Prey. Seize Prey is Night Silk's best feature. This is what makes Night Silk a good schemer, because he can travel far distances and quickly get back to the main conflict when he's needed there. When moving, make sure that he's always within range of webs he's going to want to teleport to the following turn. Because of how good the teleport is, Creep Along isn't usually used for movement. Rather, it can let Night Silk double drop ski markers in a single activation, which is what gives him his scheming power. With size 3, there will usually be something to push towards, and Night Silk only needs to push a short distance to drop 2 markers because he's on a 50mm base. The second use for Creep Along is getting an extra attack, so let's look at that next. On offense, Night Silk is good, maybe? His direct damage track is 2-3-4, and that's terrible for an 8-cost model, but also it inflicts poison and the stat 7 makes it pretty reliable. Infect does almost nothing, and healing on rams is always good. His offensive combo is to teleport to a web, double attack, and then Creep Along trigger to attack a 3rd time, so with a little setup it's almost like he has Flurry. Then Poison and Catalyst can deal an additional damage to his target, making his first hit effectively min-3 or min-4, but generally only the first. This is why I referred to Night Silk as a tank and assassin, because he doesn't really have enough damage to fit a beater role. He can take advantage of stat 7 and high mobility to go after squishy models who he doesn't need to deal that much damage to, or if he can get near poisoned and parasited enemies he can tank damage and do a little attrition work. Don't forget that getting into melee quickly is valuable for Nexus, so even if Night Silk makes a lackluster beater, providing Nexus an anchor point arguably alleviates that problem. One last note on Catalyst is that it isn't optional, and Cadmus aren't immune to poison damage. If the enemy uses poison, or if Meredith is too liberal with Rancid Transplant, Night Silk could deal a few points of damage to friendly models every turn. Cadmus already has enough of that, so be careful with positioning. Catalyst damage can be legioned onto enemies though, since it occurs in the activation phase. Webstrand is a good disruption action for keeping models engaged and weakened. It also gives Night Silk something to do at range while tanking a specific enemy. Staggered and stunned are both crippling conditions, and 5 against move is okay against schemers, good against beatsticks. The ram trigger gives Night Silk something to move enemies, possibly into engagement with itself. The Create Web bonus action makes Night Silk arguably your best web designer. If Nexus and Archivist are corporate slaves churning webs at the cost of what they really want to be doing, Night Silk is closer to a hipster with a WordPress blog and full creative freedom. Honestly, that's the worst joke I've ever made, and for the 3 of you out there that actually laugh at this, hey man, I appreciate you. Create Web is the only action in the crew which can place a web freely and doesn't require winning a duel. Night Silk should be making a web every turn he isn't scheming or needing his 3rd attack. When choosing the marker placement, ask yourself, where does Night Silk want to be next turn? Where might he be needed later in the game? Does my summoning nest need more fuel? Can I place this somewhere which can really hinder the opponent? Things like that. On turn 1, Night Silk is able to get tomes from Archivist and build the summoning nest with Webstrand too. Just be sure that the conditions don't mess your factory up. Nexus actually makes a good target because her 2nd activation will clear the conditions automatically, but that means that Nexus can't use the webs that Night Silk creates to actually do the summon either. Final verdict? In keyword, 4 stars. On the forums, I see prospective Cadmus players are actually leaving Night Silk behind, but I'm going with my gut. He's good. Most important to me, Night Silk is the most flexible option for positioning webs, and the extra 3 he provides on turn 1 really help the summoning nest work at full capacity. His damage may not be worth his full 8 cost, but offense isn't his primary purpose anyway. His offensive contribution comes from being where he's needed and applying his damage or conditions to the right targets reliably, not having big damage numbers. As an independent mobility piece, he also covers what the crew lacks most. Cadmus core consists of fairly static models, and most of their movement effects are pulls rather than pushes. I think Night Silk perfectly creeps in. Out of keyword, 1 star. There's just not much reason to take Night Silk without his most important synergies. Explorers have enough strong mobile out-of-keyword choices. Spell Eater, 7-cost minion. The Spell Eater's strength has gone through some hot debate. Let's look at what he has to offer, starting with the good stuff. Spell Eaters won't be tanking dedicated melee beaters for long, but they can absorb attacks quite well. Decent defensive stats, 7 health, and Arcane Shield 1 along with Legion make a good base. Redirect Magic takes this up a notch, making the Spell Eater immune to triggers. The power of ignoring triggers is dependent on the attacking model, but it's not like strong triggers are uncommon in Malifaux. It's a really good ability. Elemental Backlash provides some unique discard synergy. It's a disincentive for the opponent to avoid Nexus's Parasite tokens, the Spell Eater itself can force some discards, and it synergizes with the bonus action on Archivist and EyesAndEars. Like I always say, burning and poison aren't great after the first point, but because the crew has Transmutation and Catalyst synergy, and because you can give 1 point of each condition, it's actually much better than similar mechanics that try to stack only one of them. Down to the last drop is the best action Spell Eater has. It's a lot like Nexus's, but it doesn't have any bonus action competition, so it might even be the best Parasite Pulse overall, or at least the most flexible. When targeting an ally near a parasited enemy, it can even deal 2 unavoidable armor-ignoring damage to a single enemy. Siphon Existence is your typical throwaway melee attack on a ranged model, except it has Transmutation. Most importantly, this is a source for Focus +2 from a single AP, although not exactly since a condition needs to be set up. Finally, Elemental Blast is the Spell Eater's primary attack. It has bad damage, but also a decent range, stat 6, and thanks to Redirect Magic, it ignores resistance triggers and will almost always trigger itself. Drain Magic is the best trigger by far, giving you a cycle and forcing a discard from the opponent, but the other two aren't bad. Both of them can double, but that's unlikely unless the target has a Ram or Tome built into their defense. For Spell Eaters, we're gonna skip forward to the rating in the middle of the review. Out of keyword 1 star shouldn't be surprising due to Cadmus synergy. In keyword, 2 stars. Let me explain. I really like Spell Eaters, and I wish they were worth it. They have some strong points, but until now I left out the reasons they aren't good enough for 7 cost. First, Redirect Magic isn't optional and affects friendly models. This means Archivist can't give them suits, and the triggers on Exoskeletal, Will of Cadmus, and out of keyword support effects can't be used on them either. I'm pretty sure this means Explorers have no way of getting Transmutation out of activation, which would have been a great option to have. Let me know if I'm wrong about that in the comments. Second, and most importantly, Elemental Blast doesn't counteract Concealment or Friendly Fire. The poor 2-3-4 damage track doesn't synergize well with Focused, nor is the Spell Eater happy concentrating when it'd rather be hitting targets with Elemental Blast or transmutating Focus +2 for someone else. Therefore, Spell Eaters are not actually ranged attackers, they just use their bonus action to spread parasites and maybe fire a shot or two when available. They're more of support models meant to hang around Nexus or Archivist, give Focused, and suffer their damage. But why pay 7 cost for a glorified health battery when you can use a summon or hire models that are cheaper and work better for that role? Or a combination of those, one for Legion and one for Siphon power. We'll get more to that later. Transmutation has problems too. First off, let's note Nexus can use Transmutation, especially on turn 1 before it starts eating into her attacking. It requires being within an inch of an ally, and any good opponent should be taking blast attacks against Cadmus to keep you on your toes with perfect positioning. It also relies on Meredith to rancid transplant poison onto friendly models. If you're doing that, you can transfer focus from an EyesAndEars or 2 anyway. Sure, it isn't as much focus turn 1, but that doesn't cost 7 stones either. Spell Eaters also make terrible Siphon power batteries, like I mentioned. They're one-shottable after taking just 3 damage. If you desperately need a protector, Intrepid Emissary is obviously your guy. If you want as much focus as possible, take Mr. Nataro, who can generate 4 per turn and synergizes better with the movement support, poison, and control part of the crew. Otherwise, for almost half the cost, 1 Hopeful Prospect and 1 free EyesAndEars are better for sticking near Nexus by far. The Hopeful doesn't need to be closer than 4 inches to a friendly model, he cycles cards, provides a little focused, more consistently heals or removes conditions, and most importantly is still not one-shottable after taking 2 Siphon damage. Not to mention if he gets a kill, he can turn into a Spell Eater anyway. Basically, this is the opposite of what Night Silk does. Cadmus already has enough investment into centrally located and mostly static ranged attackers or support models. He just isn't an impressive enough improvement on that saturated front. He also isn't a good option for scoring any scheme in the game, and the support that he provides can be done by other choices that are cheaper. The exception to this is when going against specific enemy crews which are vulnerable to elemental backlash. The best one I've thought of is Tormented, where Jackdaw is dead if he stays within 6 inches of the Spell Eater for long. Forgotten's main mechanic is discarding, so I would assume Spell Eaters are good there too. Maybe there are some other keywords I'm not thinking of off the top of my head. Berserker Husk, 6-cost minion. If you play video games, you can already guess what the Husk plays like. They're easy to hit but resilient to damage, and for the most part they rush into melee as soon as possible. 8 health and hard to wound plus Legion synergy is similar to Night Silk. The Husk from Meredith's Fungus comes with 7 health if you include the Eyes and Ears initial 3, healing 3 when replacing, and healing 1 when it activates near Meredith. The resilience is necessary because their stats are terrible. Ruthless counteracts their weak willpower against Terrifying though, and the likelihood to lose duels makes it an easy choice to relent against parasited enemies for a triple negative damage flip. Move 4 is naturally slow, but their bonus action gives them a great 6-inch unimpeded move. It requires a model with a Parasite token, so note that Nexus can give friendly models Parasite tokens while transmutating, at no detriment except in mirror matches. This is especially nice for navigating through webs, and can enable double ski marker drops. Their built-in defense trigger can occasionally help with moving towards ranged enemies, but more importantly it prevents 2-inch engagement ranges from keeping the Husk 1 inch away if they attack defense. Remember, you can't declare triggers when relenting. The Husk's melee attack has no business being stat 6 or having 2 good triggers, and yet there it is. The damage isn't great, but not awful. That Severe of 5 remains relevant because Eyes and Ears can keep their focus after replacing. Swarm of Mites is identical to the Nests, but better mobility and the triggers make it much more powerful on Husks, especially with a mask. If you aren't watching the review in order, check out Archivist for how to really abuse this action. Note that the Crow trigger will apply to friendly damaged models as well as the enemy. Best of all though, Husks have the Relentless ability. Much like Archivist's Demise Ignore, ignoring resistance triggers won't come into play every game, but is insanely strong against many powerful models, namely Colette, Ironsides, Shtuk, Bete Noir, Minico Ray, Zip, all of Amalgam, every rider, and anything with Squeal. That's a pretty impressive list. Final verdict? In keyword, 1 star. Husks are great, but you're already getting them for free. If you want additional Husks, look into taking an out-of-keyword Cryptologist for better value. Out of keyword, 1 star. I can see maybe, just maybe, a Husk could work out of keyword, specifically only against Colette to prevent her from charging headfirst at your crew with no fear of death. I'm not sure it's a good choice, but it's worth a mention at least. Otherwise, Husks don't bring anything uniquely useful to the table. Out of keyword choices. Nesting options. My playstyle is all about value and is very slow paced. Therefore, I want to summon with Nexus as much as possible for as long as possible during the game. The choices here are ones that can drop 2 ski markers on turn 1 to load up the summoning nest and have me prepared and not having to spend actions to reload it later. The most generally useful, and my personal baseline to compare all the other choices to, is Austera and Twidge. Now, first and foremost, you're going to see a lot of Seeker models because Chronicle and Unimpeded synergizes very well with Cadmus. Meredith's healing lets Chronicle trigger again and again as long as things are activating near her, while Unimpeded just lets models be immune to all the web markers that are going to be littering the board. Austera and Twidge starts 6 inches up the board and can immediately drop 2 ski markers, only needing a 9. If they get a 9 of masks, she can even drop 3 ski markers. The ski marker dropped by her bonus action can also go anywhere, even within 4 inches of other ski markers, which is a huge plus. Because she builds her nest 6 inches up the board, Meredith can be exoskeletaled up, and then the summoning nest doesn't have to be all the way back in your deployment zone. Her Chronicle lets you look at the top card of your deck over and over, and either use that to plan your actions, or discard it to thin your deck of bad cards. Unfortunately, most of the healing from Meredith will come at the end of the turn, when all the Eyes and Ears you summon that turn activate one by one, after all the important activations. So thinning your deck of bad cards will not always go as far as you think, because the turn's about to be over and you won't be able to use them very well. At least once the Eyes and Ears activate, you can discard anything under an 8 and try to lure things. Also, if Austera is using her bonus action to drop a scheme marker for Nexus every turn, she's not using her best action to fight the enemy. Vernon and Wells is my second nesting choice. First turn they can walk up and drop 2 scheme markers around 5 inches up the board, and later on they can use their bonus action to walk, drop a scheme, and still have both attacks ready. As long as they're sticking around and fueling the nest, Head in the Clouds is going to help Meredith and Nexus and the rest of the models near it. Like Archivist, targeting willpower is great because most of Cadmus targets defense, and Arcane Shield +2 can set them up to be transmutationed as long as they get a third one from the Intrepid Emissary. The downside to taking Vernon and Wells is you don't get a Chronicle effect, their big base makes them suffer a lot from web markers unless they can get a mask, and they're not very good at adding more fuel to the nest once they walk away for the first time. Botanists can drop 2 scheme markers, they can act as health batteries because of the amount of healing they can get, and they probably have the easiest time getting 2 grow tokens in Cadmus relative to any other keyword. They can also make use of the extra healing from all the corpse markers that are going to be scattered from dead eyes and ears all over the board. The downside is very similar to Vernon and Wells here, they have to walk away from the nest in order to be useful. Tannenbaum makes an interesting choice. He's definitely not as consistent dropping multiple scheme markers because he needs a tome or a scrap or a corpse marker in order to make one. But he can drop markers within 4 inches of other scheme markers, and using haphazard topography he might be able to make on-the-fly mini-nests by pushing a marker near another marker and then dropping an additional scheme on top of it. That makes 3 schemes or webs total, so the only thing you need is a Cadmus standing on top of them and you've got 3 EyesAndEars. Chatty also synergizes well with Nexus's discards because the opponent's probably going to run out of cards. Comprehensive Notes is always good, he targets willpower, he has Rewrite the Story, but most importantly I think that Tannenbaum's Chronicle is actually better than Austera's. I think Cadmus will generally summon the EyesAndEars and then let them activate at the very end of the turn once all the important activations are complete and there's nothing really left to do. So in this case, if you just have an 8 on top of your discard pile, the EyesAndEars can activate, heal something, Tannenbaum places the 8 on top of the deck, and then you can use that 8 to lure. And then the next EyesAndEars does the exact same thing, as long as with the second AP they just concentrate or walk. That's just a really cool interaction, and ever since I thought of it I've really wanted to try Tannenbaum in practice with Cadmus. On the opposite end of the spectrum from all the scheme providers, we have cryptologists, which milk the nest for every bit of value it could possibly have. Their bonus action only requires a 9 and lets Meredith replace an additional EyesAndEars with a husk every single turn. However, this isn't perfect. Because you're replacing additional husk, you also have to provide additional resources, so the required number of markers per turn goes up from 4 to 5. Also, Berserker husks are minion 3, so on second turn if you want to create a 4th one, you actually can't unless one of the other ones have died. Still, it is creating a second husk, and getting one killed on turn 2 doesn't seem that hard if you just stick them in the opponent's face. The mask trigger on the bonus action is a pseudo-obey, so you can get an extra Rancid Transplant out of Meredith, but it's a little awkward to get a condition on her in the first place. The Cryptologist also has a really good attack if you can hit severe damage, and he draws you a card as long as he stands near a scrap or corpse marker, which shouldn't be that hard once some EyesAndEars die. He's really slow, but at least he's immune to web markers, which might count for something, and Ancient Technology is usually pretty useless, but at least in Cadmus it can actually prevent Catalyst from Night Silk from doing any damage to your own models, which is really helpful because if you take the Cryptologist, Night Silk is basically not optional and he's a 5-star model. So more or less with the Cryptologist, you're just doubling down on this really slow, value-centered playstyle. I guess his name is fitting, because if you invest into crypto, you never know if it's going to make you a millionaire or bankrupt you. Now some regular out-of-keyword options. Intrepid Emissary and Effigy are always a good choice with basically any crew, as I keep saying, but Emissary is really good with Cadmus because you have so many squishy models that are absolutely essential to the game plan. He also provides 1 additional shielded to models like Archivist or Vernon and Wells, which is just enough to get them to 3, meaning that Nexus can now transmute them and give them focus +2. The healing aura is also really strong. Cadmus have a lot of high stats and a lot of simple duels, so it'll be triggering pretty often. But yeah, this one's really simple. He's just a really big model that will absolutely protect your pieces that need protecting, and he's just going to stand there and roar until something gets close and then attack it. The Damned is also really strong with Cadmus. He's not a nesting choice because despite the fact that he can drop 2 ski markers in a turn, he just wants to focus so badly on turn 1 that I don't even think it's worth it to drop the ski marker. He's a totally independent model that can leap all over the board. He synergizes crazy well with focus that Cadmus can help him get using Meredith. And Breath of Frost is absolutely brutal if you get a few points of injured out there because suddenly it becomes really easy to hit with a focus. Believe it or not though, those actually are not the reasons that the Damned is so good with Cadmus. I actually think that the most broken thing is his Chronicle. You're gonna have to picture this in your head, but imagine you have the summoning nest in the back with Meredith and 3 eyes and ears, and then in front of that you have, let's say, Nexus, like 3 inches up, and then in front of that you have some other Cadmus model like Night Silk or something, and then in front of that you have Berserker Husk in combat with an enemy. And the Damned is just within 6 inches of that Berserker Husk. Now, as each of those models in the nest activate, they can daisy chain their healing up to the Berserker all the way at the front, and because it all happens at different activations, the Damned can now cause the Berserker to pulse a damage every single time, meaning with 3 eyes and ears, that's 3 damage, and it's completely unavoidable. Granted, that huge daisy chain is going to be really hard to set up, so I don't know how easy it'll be exactly to realize that. Next we have the Hopeful Prospect, one of my favorites if you haven't noticed. Basically the Hopeful does everything he does in every other crew, except 3 new things. Number 1 is with all of the injured that Nexus can give out, Hopefuls can probably reliably hit and upgrade into a new model. Number 2 is, because Nexus has the Will of Cadmus upgrade, she counts as the killer for anything that dies to parasite damage. Also, she just does a lot of damage and kills things easily on her own, so she can pretty easily get the focused from Good Show, I think. And number 3 is that Hopeful Prospects have 4 health, but after taking 2 points of damage, they still have hard to kill, so they're gonna take another 2 attacks in order to take out, meaning you can safely siphon them for 2 health and never worry about it. Even if they do end up dying, you don't really care because you're playing Cadmus, and if you're playing Cadmus, you definitely have the Flush with Cash upgrade, so you at least get a Soulstone back from that. Now we're going into some of the more niche options. So first we have Mr. Nataro. He obviously gives a ton of focus, but also his abilities just seem like he's really made to go into Cadmus for some reason. Cadmus spread a lot of poison, and he has crazy poison synergy. Cadmus have a lot of actions that can target friendly models, especially ones at low stat from the Eyes and Ears luring, and he gives all those +1, although he doesn't give +1 to attacking parasited enemies. He's not really to my taste because he's a little too squishy, but he's solid, I guess. Next we have Ava Havenhand, who is basically just Ava Havenhand. She does exactly what she does in any other crew, she's really good, and she can lock away web markers, which is really good. That's about it. And finally, the weirdest pick is Calypso Mark II. Yes, Calypso Mark II without B-Bay, and that's just because you can make an Eyes and Ears and stuff it into Calypso, and then you have a Calypso that has 2 activations by himself. And if Calypso ever dies, then the Eyes and Ears pops out, and the explosion puts it down to 1 wound, or if it's already damaged, kills it, and then it gives parasite tokens. That's the whole combo. Like, that's literally it. I don't think it's very good, but it could maybe be good if your opponent makes a lot of hazardous terrain or something, and you really need to ignore that. And that's the end of out-of-keyword options. I obviously went with a much more off-the-cuff, sort of just talking to the microphone style for these. Let me know if you like this more. I'm definitely going to stick with a scripted part for the rest of the main review parts, but this video is obviously going to push an hour easily, so I just kind of want to get it out there and finish it. I'm still quite uncomfortable talking into the microphone without a script, so I hope this was still an acceptable quality, and we're going to move on to Counterplay like normal and then close out the review. Counterplay. Take blast markers, especially double blasts, and shockwaves to bomb the nest to pieces. Even if you don't get in range or can't activate properly to use it, you always want the option available to capitalize on mistakes. Eyes and Ears are especially vulnerable with their low defensive stats. High defense on your models is more important than willpower. Cadmus's most dangerous attacks in simple duels target almost exclusively defense. Taking models who can ignore pulses and shockwaves can help too. Don't rely on hard to kill, demise, or resistance triggers. Cadmus have options to handle all of these, although most of that comes from Archivist, so killing him is also a solution. Minimum damage 3 will help immensely. Because Legion bounces damage back to parasited enemies, the higher damage each attack does, the less damage is bounced, at least in theory. The crew also features a lot of hard to wound and low health Eyes and Ears, whose weaknesses is min 3 attacks. Be careful with Quarantine. Don't place halfway into a tight corridor on the board and get trapped. Take models with 2-inch engagement ranges, ranged attacks, push effects, and so on. Elite crews are more easily bogged down by web markers and Eyes and Ears. Having cheap models around who can remove destructible terrain and kill Eyes and Ears will go a long way. And finally, have multiple plans to ruin Cadmus's machine, and follow the path of least resistance. If Nexus is protected by Intrepid Emissary, go after the Nest. If the Nest is protected instead, go for Nexus. If it's both, blast them, or go after Archivist. Don't let Cadmus claim all their objectives and attack you while you murder waves of summoned minions. That'll get you nowhere, and those waves won't end unless you make them end. And with that, Cadmus is done. Finally. I hope you enjoyed this review as much as I enjoyed picking apart this crew. I think this might be my favorite one in Explorers right now. As always, I'll see you next time.